In That Cornfield in the Sky, William Moldenhauer framed the crusade in supernatural terms. Once in heaven, he wrote, you'll find no weeds or insects, and you can only use mulch tillage. In the meantime, however, farmers and researchers could taste heaven on earth, thanks largely to technology. And this is about the third stanza from the bottom. New advances could well make the present surge succeed, with a pesticide for every bug, one for every weed. Neither Moldenhauer nor his peers ever fully addressed, however, that their technological salvation was not for everyone. Narrow was the path to that cornfield in the sky, and few had the means to enter. Thank you.
Hello once again. This was a great panel. Wow, did those papers fit together? I don't know if they decided this in advance, like people coordinating what they're going to wear or something, but those really fit together well, especially in terms of both being phenomenal agricultural history papers combined with what I even like better, connections with environmental history. That's my favorite kind of agricultural history, and these really do that really well. Whereas the last session we had a lot of papers that looked at economics, especially maybe this role of capitalism in interesting ways. This time it's definitely where policy and politics meets environment, and policy making even especially. But in that regard, then I think both of these papers need to have a little stronger look at the role of the New Deal, the role of the state here. And it almost seems absent, and if that's the case, if the New Deal really was, if New Deal technocrats were that absent for both of these situations, that's kind of an interesting story in and of itself. I kind of don't know, and I would think that they would be more involved, but perhaps that is definitely the case. But very good papers both, and well delivered, and both of them very well written and organized, and will make great contributions to this book, Kathy and Brian. If that's the direction you're headed here, I think they would really be great contributions. Let me go to Michael's paper first here. Measuring Expertise, Ralph Marshall and Watershed Management, 1920 to 1940. Missing in your title, Michael, is you really have to put Northeast Colorado. Especially for a book like this, just that title alone isn't going to give us very much. And especially since you're so regionally oriented here, I think that's going to be really important. And on that point then, when you said you're going to be using the word Piedmont, you do throughout, and you said, if you don't mind, I mind. People there do not call that region the Piedmont. Now that's very nice that Bill Wyckoff calls it that, sitting in his office in Bozeman, Montana. But people in that part of Colorado do not call it the Piedmont. The Piedmont means foothills. Okay, that's what that means. And we're not really, we're east of the foothills here, where we're going to be growing sugar beets and things like this. So I don't know about it. It's all through your paper. You might want to think about that. I know you frame it that way in interesting ways, but I'm up. Nonetheless. Okay, other points here too. I really loved your illustrations. They were great. It would have been nice to have had them in the paper too, but make sure those maps especially make it into the final copy. Those maps were beautiful. They really do explain everything just so graphically. Kathy, do you like maps? I don't know if you like maps.
I believe so.
So get them in. They're really good. You start off this paper with this idea of how watersheds in eastern Colorado are certainly very different than those in western Colorado, and yet that's where most of the water is, over on the western slope, and yet people settled over here in eastern Colorado in the plains. And so fair enough. I don't think that's too surprising, though. The western slope isn't as conducive. It's over the mountains. It's a longer ways away. So in some ways, I don't think it's surprising, despite the fewer water resources. But nonetheless, it is a very interesting take on that. And so I'm not sure most newcomers would have really thought about that, though. And if you have a difference on that, that would be a good thing to include here. In terms of also this idea of being in the Great Plains, it certainly does fit that really well, because eastern Colorado definitely fits that well, so that's gonna be great. You talk a lot about Marshall being from Colorado Agricultural College. You might want to just put the first time used later CSU, right? That becomes the land grant school, Colorado State University. I would certainly recommend that. And in yours, Josh, you keep talking about UNL, and it wasn't called that until much later, because there wasn't a UN Kearney yet and things like that. So probably just University of Nebraska might fit wherever you say UNL, because it certainly wasn't called that then. Let's get to this part where you want to revise. Okay, you want to be revisionistic here and be a corrective. You write on the bottom of page 3, Michael, that Partial's work during the 30s is both a necessary corrective to water business. Well, now wait, his work wasn't the corrective. Your interpretation is the corrective here going on, but I disagree. I don't think it's a corrective, and we're going to get to that in a minute, okay? It's still a really important story to tell, but I don't think it's going to be the kind of corrective or revisionist history that you're arguing it is right now. So what happens here is when you argue that the most impacting decisions regarding water, and especially irrigation, were made at the local level and regional level by water managers and engineers, is a great thesis. And that applies perfectly to this unique story of Northeast Colorado. But does it apply anywhere else? If it does, I think at that point we need another paragraph saying where there's similar situations that were locally controlled water projects. Because right now, the big water projects in the West are the ones that had a lot of huge federal largesse, are the kind that Don Worcester discusses, are the kind that Don Pisani discusses, but with different interpretations, like Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, the Central Utah Project, the Central Arizona Project, the Garrison Diversion in North Dakota. All of those and many, many others fit the model of Rivers of Empire in a really big way with the power things involved. This one shows that it doesn't. Here we have an interesting local case. But I don't think that's a corrective that now we should see that water projects in the West or water projects in the Great Plains don't have that theory of power behind them. We'll come back to that in just a minute, but I think that's something that we should be thinking about your paper here. Then in page 6, you get to this idea that Partial possessed a faith in technocratic expertise that helps to explain this particularly instrumental view of rivers. Really great point. Was he informed by Taylorism or by positivism, this idea that tech solves at this kind of era? And he may very well have been, but I think if you could get into his mind a little bit more, if you could get into his skin, his background a little bit more, especially if he was being informed by Taylorism or these kind of things, that might really help explain the time period involved. But especially this very, very pervasive thinking of tech solves in a big way certainly is true. Both papers, I think, have a moment of being really important ideas for transnational history, but then it kind of drops. And again, these are draft papers, I realize, and you want ideas for expanding for the book. And I think that one way, of course, one of my areas certainly is looking at transnational history, and these do that, but then they kind of just stop from going on. Here you write that the Partial flume was used in Hawaii, Canada, Central and South America, and Africa. That is pretty amazing technological export. That's actually really interesting from Northeast Colorado there. But I would just explain Canada, big country. Where, is it Western Canada where they were irrigating? Also, I would even maybe for the larger project here, put where in Central and South America and Africa it was adopted, because I think readers would be very, very interested in that. And would be this interesting way of expanding on the transnationality of your thesis here. Getting back to this idea of the whole idea about you do mention New Deal programs, and I think you and Josh both get into this in an interesting way, but again, I think it probably should be expanded. On the idea of sugar beets and the economics of sugar beet growing, especially because there was such high demand. Well, that's true. There was this huge market demand for sugar, especially with especially after the McKinley tariff, okay, which is a protectionist policy to produce more sugar at home. You might want to get into that kind of policy making a little bit more. But also there's other things going on besides market demand. There are other exogenous factors for beet production. We have growers that are just doing their contract growers for Great Western. And so that's interesting, often taking turns with their fields, growing malt barley in other years for contract with Coors and Anheuser-Busch. So in this region. So I think there's other reasons than just the market demand there and the great demand for sugar that you might want to just investigate a little bit. On the idea of a tunnel, that, yes, exactly, a whole other paper, a whole other 3-hour conversation about building a tunnel under Rocky Mountain National Park. But that might be a moment you should mention the Moffett Tunnel, okay, under the Front Range that brings water in. I think that might be a moment to at least allude to that. So you could draw parallels there a little bit because it wasn't quite alone. And that obviously serves Denver and things, but nonetheless. Let's go back to this one thesis. On the bottom of page 13, you mentioned that farmers and local water managers should occupy an important space in our understanding of water in the West or the Plains. Absolutely, a place, but not the only place. And I think that might get a little bit varied. because this is where we get into this idea of a lot of other things going on. If there are other examples that you can show us, that you could write about, that would be a pattern developing across the West, that would help convince me. Because right now I'm not really too convinced. I think there's too many other things going on with power, especially with the Bureau of Reclamation, especially with the 6 companies that were involved with places like Hoover and things. So there definitely is, and there's kind of this little cottage industry growing about to be against Don Worster. That's what, did Paul let you get away with this in Boulder? I'm really surprised that he would have let you get away with these under Worcester student at Colorado, Paul Sutter. And it makes me a little surprised, actually, because, and I've run into a lot of other scholars across the world who, think Worcester's wrong. But I think on this, Worcester's right. And I think, again, you're going to have to prove to me that these kind of smaller projects have that much influence. All right. We're going on now to this other kind of similar paper about the idea of people having an idea and making it work. Both of these papers speak to that in such interesting ways. And, so now, that's great, I love it. So a great paper, Josh, and a fellow Jayhawk. Yay, okay, that's great. We studied with Sarah up there. Sarah could have been here today, but you should be very proud of you. What I love about this story, too, is not only is it really well written and it flows so well, great title, great hook at the beginning, of course, The Cloud of Saving Flames. That's a great hook, and really, really works well. And a really nice analysis, too, towards the end on the chemical herbicides used as a part of what becomes minimum till or zero till, which I think probably should be explained in that opening paragraph. The stubble mulching also has these terms like minimal tilling and zero tilling, which come much later in the paper, but I think for readers, they might want that a little bit earlier on. I, of course, like stories about agricultural technology that have such kind of multifaceted aspects to them. Obviously, you related, I thought of many things about the relationship of that with binders, and even you wrote on page 17 that these interests become even further entwined. But nonetheless, the idea of the stubble mulcher, too, in terms of also reducing the numbers of time through a field, all those kind of things are really a part of it. Again, one agricultural implement that has so many different facets to it. And so it's a really great story to tell, and I continue to hope you keep telling it well. Have you been to the Farming and Ranching Museum in Gering, Nebraska? You need to go. They have this great exhibit there of this very instrument, implement. And I didn't even understand it very well until I saw it. It's in Gering up there, the Farm and Ranching Museum in Gering by Scotts Bluff, and I would encourage you to go see how that would work. They have it, and then you can get copies of their book. They can sell it in the bookstore there, the gift shop, right? They'll want to do that for sure. Again, phenomenal illustrations, and more than you had here in the paper, of course, but that really turned out well. All right, this idea also of your thesis of the conservation industrial complex works. I really agree with that. Obviously, we know about the military industrial complex, Eisenhower. There's the sports industrial complex with stadium after stadium being built, and things like that. So this really is a nice framework for that in interesting ways that I certainly embrace and encourage you to play more with. But now we get into this idea, too, of the Dust Bowl and Great Plains aridity. And my biggest surprise reading your paper was that the developers, Dooley and Russell here, didn't really have that politicized at all. That's an interesting part of the story. They might have been apolitical scientists or tinkerers or developers of this implement, but it also kind of makes me wonder, why were they so reluctant? Why was there so much reluctance to talk about soil conservation, especially in light of what had just happened, especially in the Southern Plains, and why this kind of soil conservation device would be more needed? Were they anti-New Deal, kind of like James Maywin? Were they more just, I want to show how this works for farmers and not get involved with the politics of it? And that, I don't know if you know the answer to that or not. It'd be interesting maybe to try to flesh out if possible. In your large footnote there at the bottom, you quote most of the literature on that, the Worcester, Bonneville, Kunper, all the main names, Riney, Perberg, etc. But I think also what would be very useful there is Bill Cronin's amazing article telling stories about nature, which compares Paul Bonneville with Don Worcester. It came out in the same year. It's one of my favorite essays ever, JAH, right? That first came out about the comparative article. And it really just works so well for that. Okay, other important things too that I saw in your paper were here. Again, like Michael, you want to. There's a great sense of wanting to be revisionist here and corrective, and I think we should be, especially with Faulkner. and that works really well. And I think that this will kind of put Faulkner to bed for a long time, and that's going to be important. On the dryland farming things, especially with Mary Hargraves, is there information from the dryland farm conventions? You know, they have those almost yearly conventions. That might be another really good source to hunt. Maybe you did for your dissertation. It might be useful for this essay also. And on the transnationality argument that we talked about for Michael's paper too, here you bring up on page 6 that both American and Canadian plains, this kind of dryland farming, which the dryland farming convention certainly dealt with both. But then it kind of stops. It kind of picks up later on page 17, but please don't drop Western Canada. There's too many Great Plains things to do. And here's a nice situation. Was it adopted much up in Alberta or Manitoba or Saskatchewan? So, yeah, it was
the Noble Blade.
The Noble Blade especially, which was a little bit different, right? So that's a nice story as part of this that's good. You do bring up some New Deal things too on page towards the going on here, but I think that might be able to do more with that discussion. This was a surprise to me too, where you write on page 10 about the Northern Great Plains region of the SCS, based out of Kansas State. That's one of the first times Kansas will be called Northern Plains. It's kind of an odd drawing of the map there too, but lots of New Dealish things are going on here, like Dooley placed tremendous faith in research and technology. That's the technocrats, that's the things. And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at Jess Gilbert's book yet, The Intended New Deal, which I think is one of the best yet. It's the Saludos Prize winner last year from Ag History. Might have some interesting things to do that you could add with this too. But more importantly, Hugh Bennett comes into the game here. And I thought Hugh Bennett on soil conservation came in kind of late, not till page 12. And again, the technocrats there. And I'm not sure how much he got involved with this. Obviously, he was busy looking at erosion problems elsewhere in the United States. But this, I think, must have somehow come across his desk, and there might be more to it. Sam Stalcup, who was a PhD student here under Don Pisani and me, wrote his dissertation on Hugh Bennett. You might want to check that dissertation out online. And the whole history of the Soil Conservation Service. And I wondered about land grant schools too. Since this is kind of so New Dealish, did a lot of the land grant schools get involved with county extension agents going out showing this, and haven't found too much about that? Or
Extension and Soil Conservation Services.
Both.
Our districts are getting involved.
Yeah, good. Yeah, in the 40s. Okay, good. Because if that's the point, was it up there with the same other kind of New Deal conservation policies like listing, the Tailored Grazing Act, shelter belts, all those kind of things? You might want to frame the stubble mulcher in with some of the other technologies going on at the same time. And cost of implements, it seems like it was a pretty relatively, not a very pricey implement for farmers to get, so they should have got on board maybe a little bit more than environmental history. Comments about these papers too. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Michael. Needless to say, I'm always interested in Colorado. And my own book ends 20 years really before your start. But I'm curious, going back to Sterling's first point about the corrective. The book you mentioned by Pisani is Water in the West instead of some local trends. And I'm kind of curious why you chose to mention the one Pisani book and not the other Pisani book.
I think there's a chronology here that I probably did not make very clear. And that is that the reclaim the divided West seems to peter out in the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. And looking at the 1920s and 1930s, and seeing, and then carrying, for example, the Colorado Big Thompson project to the 1950s, I'm seeing a persistence of local control that goes far beyond where Pisani is looking at. And curiously enough, in his book on water, federal water control in the West, he ends it sort of in the mid-30s as well. And I think that, and he argues that by that particular point, the Bureau of Reclamation had largely become devoid of its philosophy that could have guided it, although it's questionable whether that philosophy even guided it in 1902 when it was formed, but that philosophy had largely dissipated by the 1930s as well. Okay. And so I'm arguing that local control remained persistent long beyond that. So I'm not sure. Yeah. So
can you think of other examples though? Like I'm wondering about, that would maybe help us be convinced that is more of a trend.
Can I let me,
Well, I look at, well, obviously Reisner as well, but I would point to Norris Huntley as well in his work on. And my argument isn't so much that it's necessarily that they're entirely wrong, it's just that the literature that predominates focuses so much, and I think it's all too easy to create works that talk about federal projects, because federal projects deal with the national government, the federal government, and deal with projects that it's a lot easier to talk about things and say, okay, here's a project that impacts a scale and scope of land and irrigation is far larger than the one I'm talking about. And I think it's absolutely necessary for us to step back and look at these small landscapes, because it's in that particular point where we see, in this particular case, federal water cut off at the point at which all the diversions and reservoirs ended, and farmers' ditches and canals and small irrigation companies began. And I don't think that the larger works out there address that. They address the power of the building and the technology and the movement of water, which is certainly important. But what about the power that's involved in determining whether water user A gets this much, or water user B gets this much, or whether we're going to spend X amount of dollars to build this small reservoir? On a small level, insignificant. But on an aggregate level, it's huge. And if we look at the northeastern Colorado, that first engineering diagram I have on the cover slide, it shows just how extensive the number of reservoirs are that exist in this region. If you stand on any hillside and you look over eastern Colorado, you see this landscape that gets 15 inches or less a year, dotted by pothole reservoirs everywhere. Literally everywhere. And you know this from your book.
yeah, and this is what I want to push on. I'm wondering if you want to make this argument, and whether we can extend this beyond northeastern Colorado is a different question, but I do think, can you go back a little bit in time, not to rewrite your whole piece, but to find precedents within Colorado water law? And I think it's Junker versus Nichols, where a big decision is essentially saying irrigation companies cannot own water. That's a huge decision, and it really feeds into what you're doing. And it actually probably feeds into a little bit about the hesitancy in terms of infrastructure and construction.
Yeah.
But I think there is a legacy in Colorado water law about trying to maintain local control,
Yes.
about a resistance to outside capital, et cetera. So what I was trying to get at is there may be some legal precedents, and maybe they're explored in your larger work, that kind of substantiate what you're talking about.
Yeah, and from what I've read, like cases like Junker versus Nichols are largely influenced by local water users as well. So I think that really kind of add some depth to what I'm trying to say. So thank you.
I mean, I think those were huge decisions to essentially say irrigation companies can't own water. That was big. So yeah, that's what I was trying to get at before. Yeah.
To Michael's point, sir, I'm curious, what about the largely underexplored local control of Mormon irrigation communities? Does that speak to this point?
Well, that's what John Wesley Powell said should be the model, except that model would last too long.
Right. Well, too long. Yeah. I recently started writing about some of this action in Southern Nevada, and I kind of thought I framed it in a similar manner, and it's not to say that these big that the Worcester Pisani theses are wrong, but as Michael says, in the aggregate, take these communities or some of these Colorado communities, and they start to.
That's what I mean. If you can show other examples, I think you misunderstood my question right here. If you can show other examples like this one, that would help convince me that there was kind of a local power. Maybe like some of the Mormon.
Well, and I think it also could be questions about the difference between construction and control.
Yeah, that's a different question.
Application and who's maintaining, and I think there is this persistence of localism that we sometimes ignore.
For this one,
If you're to talk about power in terms of the construction processes and power in terms of who delivers the specific piece of water to water user A. And I think it's really well taken that suggests that I need to look at other examples of that place, because I'm convinced that it is.
Okay.
But I haven't gone there yet.
Let's get in Jake and then Josh.
Yeah, I know when I was with the Southern Plain, like the big swirl of water there, like on that federal, it's lots and lots of tiny little wells sucking out a little bit of water. It's a huge story when it all adds up. There's federal money to help get the technology rural, but certainly I guess the closest I can think of yours would be North Beaches irrigated. It seems like a similar story. without a local user controlling their water.
Josh?
I have a suggestion and somewhat of a response to one of Sterling's comments. Well, another example is in the 1950s, especially the Soil Conservation Service has a small watershed program in which they partner with local soil conservation districts and watershed associations to do watershed development and flood control and things like that. So that might be a way that you could compare. But I wonder if the bridge or the gap between you could be bridged by a different model of stakeholder. That I don't know, like you don't have to necessarily prove worse or wrong so much as.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, exactly.
It's
But
just a different story.
and it's a different, but what if you just tell this is a different type of state? What I see here is or more of the associative state or the association state, like Brian Bell's work especially, like in which the federal government uses local, public and private intermediaries to do governing for them. So our model of state development assumes big government.
Right.
What if that model doesn't hold up here? And I don't think it does, in which case, Worcester's right, this is state development, but it's a different model. Because they're relying, it's government power coming in, giving capital, doing construction, but also not being worried about actual governance because they're delegating that task to local, and that doesn't rile up people's anti-statist mentalities either.
And land grant institutions are a huge part of that association.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's really fair, and I think it's trying to make this clear because I'm not in any way trying to make the argument that local control is the antithesis of state power by any stretch. And I think it's really good that you bring up Alice work because, and I need to make that clear.
That's it.
Yeah.
I would second Sterling's call for northeastern Colorado in the title, just so we can telegraph to readers that this is the plan. So just a thought. Any other questions?
So I'm not sure I understand what is the role of the state government, like the state of Colorado or the, in the early water allocation system. Because you talk about local and you talk about federal, but I'm missing the state somewhere there, and I don't even know because I'm totally ignorant about this, whether the states have any important role in the early water allocation system.
Well, the state water engineer's office in Colorado in this case was supposed to oversee allocations. And then, of course, there's an extensive, and this is where my knowledge kind of falls on some hard times. But the record system in the state that is completely separate from the state. Let me back it up. Water courts in the region are very intricate and are completely separate from the criminal courts. And it's very complex. And I haven't dealt
They're
with
separate from many civil courts too.
Yeah.
It's a very specialized branch.
Yeah. But the state engineer's office is supposed to oversee the allocations of water that exists. But the truth is they have relatively little power. So when I talk about state power, I suppose I should make this more clear. I'm mostly talking about the role, in partial case, the role of scientists in the land grant colleges, and that's more where my interests lie.
No, I was just wondering, I was like, I had these, things like, what's the state?
Yes, sir.
Question for Josh. I love the title as well, but also this idea of conservation. Thinking about the language of sustainability today and how that may or may not play, or greenwashing, as we all know, that phrase is thrown around a lot. I was just curious about because today a lot of the issues are around genetic GMO and seed technology as well, and how seeds come. Is the same folks who work on this technology also in conversation with seed modification, diversity?
On the specific technology, no. I did see some people who they weren't concerned with developing stubble mulching or conservation tools. What I did see in the archives was at the University of Nebraska, two days, there are people doing hybridization and breeding who are testing their crops using stubble mulching. But their concern isn't to develop stubble mulching as a practice. It's more to see in what conditions does our new biotechnology thrive, where does it not? How can we modify it further? But I've not gotten into a lot of the GMO stuff because I'm not seeing a whole lot of it, but
Yeah.
anyone has the recommendation that it fit well into my framework.
Questions? Comments? Going once? Okay, well, thank you very much.